Thanks for staying up later. Anthony Perkins is with us, and come November 10th, if I'm not mistaken, Psycho 4 shows up on Showtime. And in what state of affairs do we find Norman Bates this time around?
Well, you know, Norman is always trying to get it right. He's essentially a peace-loving guy who finds himself in a lot of hot water over the years. A lot of it wasn't his fault. Of course, I guess a lot of people who have an antisocial streak could make that claim. But one of the things that Psycho 4 does is with very sharply illustrated scenes from Norman's youth and his childhood, we see how come, you know, what happened to Norman's narrative that turned everything so tragically wrong.
Now, I didn't see Psycho 3, but I did see Psycho 2. And after 20-some-odd years, he's let out. He was found guilty by reason of insanity, so technically he wasn't guilty of murder, and then they said he was cured, and out he came. Out
he came. That, I guess, might be, for many people, one of the sticking points. How come a guy, during the course of Psycho 4, Norman says, "I've killed damn near a dozen human beings." That's high. That's high. He further declares that he's been through what he refers to as rough therapy. And I guess that's, you know, very confrontational, group therapy maybe, or the kind of therapy that doesn't handhold you so much, but as really confronts you with, well, you don't have to be this way. You can be another way. Presumably that's the kind of therapy that Norman has undergone between 3 and 4, which permits him to be on the outside and married.
Wouldn't you think that upon being released from the insane asylum,
he would try to keep his nose clean?
Well, not only try to keep his nose clean, but why go back to the Bates Motel?
He doesn't go back.
In Psycho 2, he does.
Oh, in Psycho 2.
Yeah, he goes back to the Bates Motel, back to his mom's house.
That was the shrink's idea, if you'll recall.
Yeah.
The shrink said, "You've got to go back here and face it." Well, I think that probably was good advice. It was very 70s advice anyway. You know, you've got to go back and see if you can't deal with this. Actually, I think to defend Psycho 2, I think that was probably pretty good. I don't think that's so bad.
Do you think that in any way the subsequent Psycho movies diminish or alter our perception of the first one? Because it's necessary to explain things that were unexplained in Psycho 1.
But still, you really can't diminish the impression of the first one. And I don't think that's a legitimate claim, really. I mean, if anything, it shows up weaknesses in the sequels, but I don't think it in any way tarnishes the first one. And furthermore, I think to have things explained, particularly by the original author, as are explained in this film, the author of Psycho 4 is the author of the screenplay of the first Psycho. So if he's doing any explaining, at least he's more or less justifying or modifying, not modifying exactly, but authenticating his own work.
For example, without giving any of it away in any of the parts, in case people haven't seen it, some of the relationships are fully explained, and there are twists and turns that you wouldn't have expected, and an aunt comes into play, and things that, if you really thought of them as a linear collection, would change the way you might have viewed some of the first Psycho.
You lost me.
Well, for example, I didn't want to give it away, but the mother turns out to have been the aunt.
I see. But we find out in Psycho 3 that in fact wasn't so. So with a canvas as small as all the Psycho films must legitimately be in order to try to keep the style of the first film, things have got to be denied and re-explained and sometimes changed. So in fact, the aunt, the so-called aunt, his mother's sister, turned out to be a she was wrong about that.
When you were making Psycho, was it frightening to make?
You know, pictures aren't frightening to make. They just aren't. They take too long. They're too technical. There's too much waiting around. There's too much dead space. There's too much calling your agent. There's too much stopping off at the coffee wagon. There's too much chit-chatting with the crew. There's too much being touched up by the makeup people. There's too much going over things with the dialogue coach. There's too much chatting with the director and griping about the long hours to find it frightening. I've never been in a picture that scared me, and I think most people would probably make that assertion. In fact, if anything, the more frightening the picture, the more lighthearted you try to keep it backstage so that it won't get too heavy.
Were you frightened at all the first time you screened the picture?
Funnily enough, the first screenings of the original Psycho were pretty tame. It was the group experience that made it good. It was when people got together and saw it in a theater for the first time that was a much, much stronger experience than that of seeing it in a small screening room, which is, of course, true of many, many pictures. But truer, perhaps, of this kind of small canvas picture than some others, for instance.
Did people, for a long while after its release in 1960 or 61, whenever it was, did people come up to you and relate their experiences? This scared me this way, or I wouldn't take a shower.
They're still doing it 30 years later. Oh, definitely. I hear people's Psycho anecdotes. I heard a couple today from people in the elevator at the hotel.
How'd they go?
Oh, I met my first wife. We went out on a blind date. She grabbed me. She scratched my arm with her nails. It was, you know, she said, oh, I'm so sorry. It was okay. We got together. We necked in the balcony. I mean, it's that kind of thing, that kind of thing that got people together, got people kind of grabbing each other and experiencing something visceral together. And I think that's great.
Norman Bates was always, even in the first Psycho, always played with a touch of humor.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the first Psycho was greeted with gales of laughter by the audience that saw it in the theaters, to the extent that Hitchcock was was somewhat shaken by this. He felt that he had lost his ability to judge an audience's reaction. He was very, very surprised that an audience would laugh as riotously at the picture as they did. For that reason, we've always tried to keep just a little bit of humor in the sequels. I don't know whether we've been successful, but we have tried to do that.
This is one you've probably been asked 5,000 times.
That's okay.
Is it possible for people to think of you as someone other than Norman Bates? Not people who know you, but when they see you on the street.
I think they do, actually, because usually people who see me on the street break into a wide smile. At least that means that they have enjoyed the Psycho pictures and other things, perhaps, that they've seen me in. But I've always been struck by the fact that I think people have taken pleasure in seeing those films. They've taken pleasure in growing up, in having had the Psycho myth, the Psycho stories, the Psycho canon be part of their lives for, you know, 25 or 25, 30 years, whatever it is. And that gives them an enjoyment. So I see enjoyment in their faces and pleasure in their faces, first of all. And, of course, that's more, that's more agreeable than seeing a shock that, oh, my gosh, what's this guy going to do?
Continuing with Anthony Perkins and Psycho 4, debuts on Showtime on November the 10th.
Who the heck watches this show at this hour of the morning?
People who can't get out of bed. They don't have it. They don't have a remote control, but they can't bring themselves to get out of bed after watching Letterman. But they're insomniacs nonetheless.
Okay,
so they're just kind of like they're rolling around, and we have sort of half their attention.
The cigarette smoke is kind of hanging off them. Yeah, I got the idea.
That's right. Or people that work the night shift.
Yeah.
Some guy just came in. He took his cab to the garage.
Just woke up.
Came back, and bingo.
I got you.
All right. How much did Psycho cost to make?
I have no idea, but it was cheap. It was a TV movie, really. It was Hitchcock's. Whether it was a bet or whether it was a. It was something like a bunch of executives sitting around in Hitchcock's presence saying that movies were one thing and television was another, and Hitchcock's persuading them that the two things needn't be so exclusive. In those days, there were very few television movies. In fact, my history of television is pretty flimsy. I'm not quite sure. Maybe there were TV movies in those days. I don't think
For those
there really
live
were.
productions like the Requiem for a Heavyweight,
that
kind of
doesn't
thing,
count.
but-
I'm talking about actual film TV. And he claimed, his conviction was that films could be made, features could be made under television conditions. And I think Psycho was one of the first pictures to prove that that could be done successfully.
What was Hitchcock like at that stage of his life? Had you worked with him or met him at any time prior to that?
He was good fun, actually. He was a good collaborator, a lot of energy, a lot of interest in what you were doing. You know, there have been so many stories. Really, there have been a number of books that have identified him and described him as being so cold and so difficult and so dictatorial in his attitude towards actors. Really, he wasn't that way at all. Or he was that way and had been that way for many films and just decided for this one time he would try to leave a legacy of a few people, a few actors who would maybe defend him 30 years later and say, you know, he was not the way he is so often described. Sometimes he had just that kind of a sense of humor, and it wouldn't surprise me if he kind of set that up a little bit.
Did he feel it necessary to let the actors in on how this was going to play out in the overview, or just,
yes.
you do this and...
No, he explained everything. And from the look of puzzlement on the faces of the crews, of the many people who had worked with him on many pictures previously, this was a different way of working for him. He explained things, he led the actors again, he led them backstage, and he kind of showed them how it was going to be done and what was going to make the audience react in a way that evidently he had not been comfortable with before.
Interesting story about the, the most famous scene, the scene in the shower.
Norman doesn't appear in that scene. That was done with doubles. Hitchcock was very eager to play fair with the audience at all times, but on that moment I think he chickened out just a little bit. He was worried that an audience would see Norman's silhouette, and the silhouette of the murdering mother that comes into the shower room in that scene is very, very different from mine. So in a way, at that point, he may have just decided that he was just too fearful to give the show away. So I wasn't in that scene at all.
Which kind of ties into my next question, because the stabbing is done right-handed.
Is it?
And you're a southpaw.
Yeah.
Which explains why, despite the overall outstanding performance, you weren't that good a ball player throwing the baseball as Jimmy Piersall, because you had to make yourself throw right-handed.
Well, I'll accept whatever credit I get for playing baseball at all with my right hand, because, you know, learning that was a slow and laborious process. I started with ping pong and went to badminton and then went to throwing very gently, because you literally have to not only relearn, but you have to teach a whole bunch of muscles that have never worked to throw anything with your quote unquote wrong hand. So it was, even if it looked like any kind of baseball, I was satisfied.
Talking about Fear Strikes Out, the
with
story
the
of
wrong hand
Jimmy
dominating.
Piersall's life. But how troubled were they by that to begin with? That the guy's not right-handed. Did they ever consider not casting you because of it?
No, I don't think so. They considered doing what they had done for Cooper in Pride of the Yankees, which was print his uniform backwards and let him use his right hand for Garrick, who was left-handed, I believe.
Yeah,
Is that
that's
right? Because, of course, that was then all they needed to do was flip the film, and he would have appeared to be, et cetera, et cetera. But for some, I guess they were just into realism. They preferred to teach me and have me taught by Tommy Holmes, by the way. You remember that ball player?
Played for the Boston Braves.
Exactly. Tommy Holmes was the one who was responsible for turning me into a few scant months, by the way, into someone who could just squeak by as a ball player.
Was Piersall happy with the way he was portrayed?
You know, I've never met Piersall.
Is that right?
No, they kept Piersall away from the shooting, and they kept me away from Piersall. It was, you know, in the days where acting styles and the whole psychology of acting was very, very much in the forefront. They didn't want to confuse me, and they didn't. I don't know what the psychology of it was really, but they kept him well away from the set.
And even after the movie came out, never a letter, never a phone call or a chance meeting?
I know he likes it. I know he liked it at the time because he used to tour around, you know, tour colleges and tour, for all I know, he may have done some mental work, some work with mental patients, showing the film and explaining the circumstances and you know, giving speeches and talks about how mental problems could be overcome. And so I know he respected it and admired it, so but I don't know the guy.
Your father was an actor, but he died when you were a small child.
Yeah.
Right? How old were you when he passed away?
5.
How much of him can you remember?
Well, I only remember him from his old films. You know, that's a strikingly peculiar way to see a parent. You know, you're seeing your parent more or less as a living person, but he's not really playing the part of the father. He's playing the part of the gangster or the doctor or something. So you're only half seeing him. It's very strange.
Do you suppose without that influence, maybe that yearning for the father who's not there, but you've got the image of him on the screen, without that influence, could you have become an actor yourself? Would you have been inclined that way?
I don't know. I know that I felt his own career was cut short when he died prematurely. And I know that I felt in a way that it was my responsibility as a member of an acting family to continue his career. The problem, I think, with all such circumstances of a son trying to equal or live up to the father's image is when the son, or daughter for that matter, I guess, more or less outpaces the parent, alive or dead. So it's difficult. I mean, I know that in my career, with a lot of luck and being in the right place at the right time and having some wonderful roles, I've probably been known to more people and done more work in my life than he was able to in his. So that's sometimes gives a son an inappropriate feeling of having exceeded somehow the father's image.
I read someplace, and you can't always believe everything you read, but that for a while after his death, you conjured up elaborate imaginary situations in which he would actually come back.
Oh, doesn't every kid in that circumstances? I think some adults do that too.
And I guess made all the more possible because you could see that image all the time.
Yeah, see him in his old films, you mean?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, I wouldn't bring this up if it hadn't been in print about 7 or 8 years ago, and you discuss it to the extent you think is appropriate, and where necessary, set the record straight, because again, just because it showed up in print someplace doesn't mean that it's true. But you were quoted as saying that your own childhood was very conflicted, and it involved some sexual ambiguity as well, and you might have been able to draw on that for the portrayal of Norman Bates.
Well, that makes good magazine reading, you know. That sells issues. Actually, I think Norman's childhood and my childhood were probably quite different. But there's no question that in the 30s and 40s, the art and the skill of single parenting was not as well understood and as skillful as it is today. There were no books, there were no articles, there were no source materials for a single father or a single mother to raise a single child. I think that's tough in the best of times. It's tough in the best educated times, as perhaps today might be. But many years ago, which is when I was a kid, you know, back in just after the First World War, it was very difficult.
Time to say goodnight. I wouldn't shower right now if I were you, but in any case, Psycho 4 on Showtime on November the 10th, and it's followed by a full, unedited and uninterrupted showing of the first Psycho from 1960, which has not been seen on national television, I'm told. I guess it shows up on independent stations, but this will be the first national viewing of it. Something of an event.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Tony Perkins, we're gone. See you later.
Bob's guest Monday will be consumer advocate Ralph Nader.